After her mother's death, a little girl took her sister to a kind soul and whispered, "Can we have milk?" Zaya the curiosity-driven 300-word hook. Jodiansko video ka akirtak bund kirekaga. Elijah Holt had learned to speak only to the wind since Sarah left the porch empty. Autumn poured over the Montana plains, gold grass bending beneath a breath of chill. He rocked once, twice, feeling the slow ache of a life narrowed to chores and memory. Far along the rutted lane a wagon rounded the rise, its wheels sighing like old bones. Dust rose, lantern light bobbed, and the driver's silhouette slumped beneath a tarpaulin. When the wagon stopped, a silence stepped off it. Two children pressed into a bundle at the center. Clara, who looked 8 summers older than her years, and a toddler named Emma, whose forehead was hot with fever. Between them sagged a woman wrapped tight in a stained shawl. Clara lifted her face, her eyes held coal and ice. She tucked the bear closer and whispered, small as a prayer, "Can we have milk?" The request struck through Elijah worse than any rifle blast. It was simple, raw, and honest as a child's pulse. He noticed a scrap of paper pinned to the woman's coat, Mary Hayes. He had heard that surname in town. Perhaps fate or some cruel coincidence had led them here. For a long beat he could not move. Memories of Sarah's last cough and the soft way she'd pass his cup came back like a ghost. A faint cough from the wagon, a smell of milk sour and damp straw, and a folded photograph in the bundle promised answers and a danger Elijah could not name. Then he stood, boots cracking in the dry grass, took his hat off as if to greet a stranger, and walked toward the wagon with a tin cup in his hand and an answer he did not yet know. What happened next will leave you speechless. Agarya Thikheta Agar, section. Set up 1,000 words. Sita like done. Elijah Holt lived alone on 2,000 acres, where the prairie bent like a low ocean beneath an autumn sky. The house leaned near a scatter of cottonwoods, its paint worn thin by wind and sun. Inside, a rocking chair waited with the faint scent of Sarah's shawl. That small fabric made the rooms map to a woman who had left them, leaving chores and quiet in her wake. Each morning, Elijah rose before light, drew water, checked the horses, and walked the fence lines that cut the acres into manageable squares. He moved by habit and memory, hands remembering work even when his heart did not. The air smelled of straw, iron, and the thin sweetness the cook used to hide in bread. At dusk, the porch groaned under boots, and the chimney sent out a small steady smoke that had once meant company and now only kept the room from freezing. 6 men kept the ranch alive. They were steady folk bred to work hard and speak little. Mending fence, shoeing hooves, hauling a bale, mending a broken plow. They arrived each season with keyless palms and the language of labor. They shared jokes at breakfast and traded tasks with a quiet efficiency. Still, when grief drew the lines on Elijah's face, they stepped back as if silence were contagious and better left alone. They brought him his coffee without asking, left the ledger open where he once crossed Sarah's notes, and gave him space to carry his absence like a tool he did not know how to use. Their loyalty was steady, but their eyes softened away from him. They honored his sorrow by not breaking. That afternoon smelled different. Autumn lay heavy across the grass, the stalks a dull gold under the low sun, and a breeze moved cold and thin across the acres. Elijah noticed the change as one notices a tremor in an old horse. Something rode the lane toward the house. Wheels grated in the ruts and lantern light bobbed like a hesitant eye. A wagon rounded the rise, paper sacks shifting and the tarpaulin's edge whipped like a tired flag. Dust rose in a soft cloud that settled on the porches and on the men's hats. The sound of the wheels carried a tired rhythm, and when it stopped, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Elijah stepped from the porch with one hand near the rifle at his hip, though he did not draw it. On the frontier, such a gesture spoke more than words. It set a boundary and offered a space for answer. He kept his steps measured, boots sinking into packed earth, and felt the rail under his palms as if he needed proof of anything still fixed in the world. In the wagon lay a woman wrapped in a shawl dulled by travel. The lines of her face spoke of long days and fewer comforts. 2 children clung to her. The elder girl held herself with a small, fierce tiredness, eyes deep as wells, hair knotted with grime. The younger child nestled close, cheeks flushed and breath quick with fever. The sight struck Elijah like cold water. The woman's stillness spoke louder than any pleading. The 6 hands gathered at the gate, each assuming a place as if called by years of practice. They smelled hay and sweat, milk left at the bottom of a pail, and something sharp that meant fever had been aboard the road. The driver did not dismount. He sat hunched, hands knotted in the reins as if the leather were the only thing left of a life he could steady. A scrap of paper stuck from a bundle, Mary Hayes, ink blurred where rain had kissed it. The name pried at a memory of town talk, A ledger entry, a telegraph that had passed through months before like a rumor. For reasons small and big, the scrap found a place in Elijah's chest like a key in an old lock. He did not hurry. He closed the distance with a slow, deliberate gait so the children would not flinch. One hand stayed near the rifle, both to mark the line between stranger and shelter and to remind himself of the rules that measured his world. When he crouched, it was without sudden motion. His weight was not to startle the smaller one. "Who travels with you?" he asked, voice rough from long disuse for such questions. The elder answered with spare words learned by travel and want. They had aimed for kin. The road had taken days. Mary had kept going, though fever carved into her, and now the wagon could go no farther. The toddler coughed and turned her face to the shawl. Warmth and sickness tangled together. Elijah stepped toward the cookhouse and fetched a tin cup. The metal was cold until he set it by the stove long enough for the heat to warm the rim. Milk, kept back for morning coffee, steamed thin and tasted of cream and the faint salt of the churn. He held the cup out without promise. The motion was simple, practical. Clara took it with fingers that bore small scars and calluses like tokens of hard days and tipped it for Emma, who drank as if the world had been waiting single-minded for that cup. The toddler's shoulders eased, the tightness easing from the small chest as warmth spread. Around them the men exchanged looks that softened and tightened at once, a small map of feeling drawn across their faces. The driver lifted his head then, revealing eyes that had seen weather enough to name it friend and foe. He spoke little, only a nod and a sound that meant they had traveled to the end of what they could travel. The men moved as a practiced unit at Elijah's crisp, quiet orders. "Bring blankets, fetch fresh water, stoke the lantern." They lifted the woman with the careful hands of men accustomed to the weight of animals in bodies, and carried her toward the barn where dry hay offered a softer bed than hard ground. Elijah gave the directions like a man resuming a part he had set aside. He found authority again in making a place for another's sorrow. In the dim barn, the lantern light drew lines across faces, and baled hay held the smell of dry sun. They wrapped the woman in cloth brought from the house, laid her on a bed of straw, and covered her as the hands folded like stitches over a wound. Elijah paused to read the smeared ink on the folded paper the woman had kept close. Mary Hayes, the name again, the ink kissed by rain and tread. He thought of the telegraph office in town, of a clerk who had said names aloud, and of Sarah's tidy ledger where she had counted seed and debt with neat strokes. Suddenly the strangers in the wagon were a thread he could follow or untangle. The choice of what to do with the names sat heavy and real. Night came with a thick dark that brought the stars like a scattered handful of lanterns. The cookhouse stove burned steady, and the children curled under a blanket near its warm belly. The 6 men kept a quiet vigil, tending stew and mending a harness, as if those tasks could stitch the moment into something bearable. Elijah sat again on the porch, rifle across his knees, though his fingers had loosened from its wood. He listened to the wind move over 2,000 acres and felt the small ember of something he had not known he still kept, an answering ache that Sarah's absence had hollowed and the rival had reopened. He watched them and felt something. Elijah closed the door behind them with a soft click that separated the cold road from slow heat. Clara carried Emma like someone balancing a secret. The toddler's head lay against her shoulder, hair damp where sweat met fever. Elijah set a kettle on the stove and moved like a man returning to an old possibility. His hands trembled when he reached for the bread box and lifted a tin cup, but he worked with the economy learned from years of chores. Clara's dress hung patched at the hem, sleeves crudely sewn, shoes worn thin. Emma's gown was too small and frayed, the neckline stained where milk had missed its mark. Their faces mapped hunger and travel, cheeks hollow from dust and thirst. Yet Clara carried herself with a quiet dignity that made Elijah's throat tighten. She moved with practiced care, holding the bear like a relic. Elijah poured milk into the tin and warmed a slab of bread by the stove. The smell of grain filled the kitchen. He set the cup down and watched Clara hesitate, as if kindness required proof. Emma grasped the cup with urgent, clumsy fingers and drank in small, greedy gulps, each swallow easing the tightness in her chest. "When have you shown kindness in a dark moment? Share your story." Clara told their story in careful pieces. Mary had been trying to reach an uncle in Helena after fever took their father. They had traded coin and goods for passage and food, hitching to the will of weather and strangers. The fever crept until Mary could not stand and finally closed her eyes for the last time. Clara's voice caught only once as she spoke the name of the town and the way the road had narrowed. Emma coughed into Clara's shoulder, a sound that made Elijah's chest ache. He wrapped a wool blanket around the child and lifted her into his lap, feeling thin heat and fragile pulses beneath skin that had rarely known softness. His palm on her back was clumsy but careful, She relaxed for a breath, and the memory of Sarah's small trust pressed at him like a tide. The cook left a shallow bowl near the stove, then stepped away to mend a torn apron. Outside, sun sank and stars pricked the sky like scattered lanterns. Elijah's hands shook when he placed the bowl by Clara, not from cold but from the sudden pressure of responsibility. He felt the weight of choosing to shelter two wandering children and all the small things such a choice required. He found Mary Hayes's papers wrapped in oilcloth, a passage read, a faded photograph, a cramped note. The papers smelled of rain and leather and told of a woman who had tried to stitch a life together with what little she had. The name linked them to town and to the Telegraph's slow insistence, and that knot pulled Elijah toward action. Elijah fetched spiced tea in a soft cloth to cool Emma's fevered brow. Clara pressed the cloth with exact, careful hands. The gestures made the room feel less like a house holding absence, and more like a place trying to become home. Hay and horse breath shifted in the barn like a quiet chorus. After the warm meal, Clara spoke of small comforts to keep the dark honest. How Mary hummed an old hymn when she mended socks. How Emma slept clutching the bear. How they smiled crooked at shopkeepers when coin ran out. Those memories sketched Mary alive in small gestures rather than leaving her as an empty name. Elijah answered with details about the ranch he had shared with Sarah. Her neat ledger, the way she folded letters, the morning she brewed coffee with a pinch of spice. Listening, he felt the ache in him shift towards something like care. Elijah listened to the quiet around the stove and felt the ranch hand's presence like a steady backdrop. They spoke in low tones, keeping to the business of warmth, stoking coals, setting clean cloths, checking lantern. Their movements reassured him. Tom brought a jar of preserved butter and broke off a piece of bread with careful hands. Another man tightened a blanket at Emma's shoulders and hummed a work-rough lullaby that settled like a balm. Elijah washed the children's faces with a cloth warmed at the stove, blotting away dust and crusted grime. Emma's eyelids fluttered as if dreaming. Her skin warmed under the cloth and the fever's heat waned to half-breath. The tin cup left a line at the child's mouth and a smear of milk at the corner, each sign of nourishment read like proof that life could be altered by small acts. He warmed more milk and crushed a slice of bread to make a soft mush. He could spoon slowly into Emma's mouth, watching how the small jaw worked to take the food. Clara watched everything with a fierce watchfulness that softened only when Emma's breathing eased. She spoke of Helena not as a place but as a promise, an uncle who once said he would help if they could only arrive. The road had been a gamble against weather and strangers. The wagon had broken an axle 2 days out, and then the fever had taken Mary's step. Clara had tried to hold the reins of grief and duty in one small set of hands, guiding Emma when the world offered little else. Elijah felt the old rules of the frontier settle over him. You help when you can, you bury the dead properly, you ask the town for law's assistance when needed. He set a basin near the stove to soak a stained skirt, thinking of practicalities while his heart turned over something softer. He thought of legal papers and telegrams, of the sheriff in town and how quickly the telegraph might answer, but also of the heavy daily business of care that needed no law, more cups of warm milk, a place by the fire, hands to mend the torn sleeve. He thought of names in papers again and the step that would come in morning, a visit to town, a letter written, an inquiry made. For now, however, what mattered was nearer. Emma's little chest rising and falling, the soft press of Clara's hand on her back, the smell of warm bread and milk, the faint tang of hay drifting in from the barn. The ordinary chores of a ranch: mending, feeding, tending, dove into the moment, and made space for care. As the night stretched, the light from the stove painted the kitchen in soft gold. The wind tapped at the eaves like a cautious visitor, and the old house creaked with settled age. Outside, the plains lay wide and indifferent, but within the kitchen the small acts of easing suffering multiplied. Elijah found himself humming an old hymn Sarah had liked, and when he did, the sound filled a space and seemed to make room for new purpose. The men nodded quietly as if hearing a signal. He stepped to the window and looked over 2,000 acres laid in silver frost. The plains moved under wind like a living thing. Thoughts of Helena, kin, and telegraph lines threaded through him. Law and distance and the odd machinery of guardianship felt heavy and distant. Yet the immediate smallness of the girl's needs made those complications less urgent than a warm bed and steady food. Before sleep took him, Elijah wrote a short note to the town sheriff seeking help finding relations in Helena. His pen moved with a purpose that surprised him. Then, as if remembering an audience beyond the walls, he said aloud, "When have you shown kindness in a dark moment? Share your story." The words left him like a small bridge toward others, and for the first time since the wagon arrived, he felt less alone. For now the urgent needs were nearest: a warm bed, steady food, gentle hands, and someone to stay until morning's light came. Elijah moved through the barn with a slow, careful step, lantern light deepening shadows between bales. The papers Mary had kept lay folded and damp within an oilcloth packet. Rain and dust had softened ink until some lines blurred, but essentials remained: birth dates, a cramped scrawl about a brother in Helena, and a single weary line that read like a promise. He would take them if they arrived. She had sold nearly everything after her husband's death to pay for passage, trading small household things and a last pocket watch for food and a place on a wagon. He unwrapped the papers with hands that had mended harnesses more than they had read strangers' script. The name Mary Hayes sat near the top, letters leaning as if pressed by trembling fingers. Elijah imagined choices that led a woman to fold her life into a bundle. He felt a dry recognition as if Sarah's ledger matched the cadence of that compacted courage. Mary's notes listed small acts of love: sugar kept for a child, a borrowed shawl, each line a domestic proof against a hard road. Outside, leaves let go from cottonwoods spinning thin and golden into the cold wind that pried at the barn door. Each leaf fell like a tiny resignation, and Elijah watched them count one by one against dark. He thought of seasons that had shaped the yard: the spring, Sarah planted bulbs; the drought that taught thrift; a winter when a colt fell ill and a neighbor carried heat. Those memories braided into a daily grammar of care. Mary's choices threaded into that same fabric. They wrapped Mary with burlap and oilcloth used for seed in spring, folding edges with the respect learned on land that treated bodies and animals with plain dignity. The hands that steadied a broken axle eased a fragile body into straw. They laid a small photograph beside her folded hands, a sepia face with an earnest smile that contradicted the tired lines. Clara traced the picture with a fingertip as if memorizing a curve of cheek. The barn smelled of hay and faint oil. In that scent he found a memory of Sarah rolling biscuits, flour on her palms. He stood by the pallet and let his fingers rest on coarse fabric. The act felt like a confession. He wrapped the body himself, though his hands trembled, folding a corner twice and tucking cloth under an arm with the clumsy tenderness of someone trying not to break what remained whole. Clara watched without a cry, face reserved like someone who had learned to hold storm and keep it from spilling. She placed the bear near Mary's hands, an emblem of childhood kept. Emma's confusion tracked the movement. She blinked as if the world had lost a rhythm, then reached for Clara's sleeve. Clara gave a small, unpracticed laugh that sounded like a stone dropped into a deep pool ripples. Then still. Elijah dug a grave near a stand of low cottonwoods where the land sloped toward a creek. He chose the spot because the trees broke the wind and because Sarah once favored that dawn view. The men helped, their spades biting into prairie soil with a sound both harsh and reverent. Work was silent save for the scuff of leather and occasional exhale of cold air. As they dug, Elijah felt he was excavating more than soil. He was unearthing old sorrow and finding a thread to follow. At the graveside, the preacher from town arrived in a wagon smelling faintly of leather and warmth. His words were spare and steady, fitting the place like a plain coat. He spoke of journeys and rest, of rudimentary comforts a community could offer when all else stripped away. Clara stood small and upright between two men, and Emma clung to her skirt, the child's face damp and uncertain. Elijah listened as the preacher folded hands and offered quiet phrases fitting for a small, honest burial. After the soil closed, Elijah remained kneeling longer than the others, and let his forehead rest briefly against his palm. He thought of Sarah's protests about leaving a letter untied, of how she would scold him for forgetting a name at the post. Memory came as a soft ache, less violent than sorrow, more like a thing that shaped the edges of days. He felt the kinship of loss in a way both private and expansive. Mary's life and Sarah's passing overlapped like two maps sharing a border. That night he carried Mary's papers into the kitchen and read them again beneath a lantern circle. The handwriting revealed more than survival. It showed choices made under pressure: a barter for a meal, a promised room in Helena, a note that her brother had once said he would take them in. The ink had bled where rain had kissed it, but the final line remained a stubborn hope. He made a list beside the papers: names to speak with in town, a note to the sheriff, tally of coin. He found himself thinking of Sarah's last winter, remembering the hush of a house while fever hollowed the day, the way he had clutched at small comforts and promised a life intact. Mary's ragged courage mirrored that private shape of endurance. Both women had made choices under threat to keep children fed, to trade a ring or a chest for bread, to walk hard roads with hope tucked in a pocket. That likeness tightened something inside him, welding purpose to sorrow and making the idea of sheltering feel less like obligation and more like a direction. While logistics moved him forward, the emotional work held him still. He carried Mary's wrapped form back into the barn where it lay beneath the hay, a quiet anchor in dim, Clara sat on a bale and hummed a fragment of a hymn. The tune hung in the rafters like dust motes. Emma slept against a blanket, breathing steadier now after food and warmth. Elijah sat on the threshold, hands on knees, listening to animals breathe and to wine move over 2,000 acres, feeling an ember of something he had not expected to find. He thought of how care turns outward, how acts that begin in grief become gestures that bind others. He thought of ceremony towns reserved for their own, but also of private rites ranchers performed, wrapping a body, holding a child through fever, burying a name near trees that would keep watch. In that thinking he felt the shape of what he might do next: to pitch in for guardianship, seek word of Helena, and most of all tend the two small lives left in his care. As autumn deepened, leaves continued their slow fall and wind learned new routes across prairie. Under that sky, Elijah made a promise to himself and to girls he had not meant to claim. He would not let Mary's sacrifice be a silence. He would name her, bury her rightly, and protect the slender story she left in ink and cloth. The barn doors closed with a soft thud and night settled. Stars watched. Elijah wrapped a wool blanket around Clara as the wagon bumped along the lane, frost glinting on the spokes, while a low autumn sun turned the grass to dull gold. Emma slept with a small hand closed about a stitched bear, breathing shallowly until the warmth of milk eased her chest. The scent of hay and leather rose from the wagon and felt steadier than the raw shock of the road. The men drove in quiet, letting silence hold respect for a journey that had ended in death. They entered town beneath a pale sky and climbed toward the churchyard where carved stones rose like a patient crowd. Frost powdered the turf in delicate crystals that caught the thin light. A handful of neighbors stood with measured distance, the preacher in a sober coat, the telegraph clerk with ink on his fingers, the sheriff whose face mixed duty and sympathy, and a woman carrying a patched shawl. Clara stepped down with slow composure, her small frame steady despite hunger, and led Emma by the hand as if fastening the child to courage. Elijah guided them up, worn steps, and felt an old ritual return that eased raw edges and made room for proper rites. The preacher stood and spoke with a plain voice that fit the town. He read passages about journeying, rest, and the quiet dignity of honest labor. His words were short and true, folding into a hush that felt like balm. He named Mary's courage, the road she had chosen, and the mercy neighbors gave in tending burial. Clara remained upright and silent, eyes showing a reserve shaped by hardship, while Emma watched with the puzzled attention of a child still learning what the world would ask of her. Elijah watched faces in the ring as men lowered the wrapped form into the ground. Spades cut the frosted soil with steady strokes and hands moved with practiced care. The grave ceremony followed a plain order: prayer, hymn, the lowering, and then the soft filling of earth. Townspeople exchanged nods. Some pressed cloth into his hand, others offered a folded loaf or a spare coat. The sound of footsteps on ramed grass folded ordinary measure back into the moment. When the last shovel struck, the telegraph clerk stepped forward carrying a plain envelope. He opened it with careful fingers and read a terse dispatch that carried the bluntness of distance. Mary's brother and Helena had died days earlier. No relative remained to claim the children. The news landed like a cold gust across the field. Clara's shoulders fell a fraction as the fragile hope she had held slipped, and Emma clutched the bear, blinking at sudden emptiness. That telegram altered the map beneath their feet, where the promise of an uncle had offered shelter. Now legal steps would shape the next hours and days. The sheriff explained quietly the process required by county law: post notices, search for known kin, and if no claimant appeared, allow the court to appoint a temporary custodian. Documents would record care and protect the children from being shuffled again. Practical procedures mattered. Elijah understood, and yet the human need before him asked for immediate shelter and warmth. He thought of Sarah's neat ledger and the small reckonings she kept: seed bought, debts paid, kindnesses tallied. Mary's papers wrapped in oilcloth read like a parallel record: items traded for passage, a list of contacts in Helena, a short note saying a brother had once promised help. Those modest records revealed a life ordered around love, practiced through scarcity. The likeness between the two women moved Elijah. He imagined them each making hard choices to keep children fed and safe, and that image loosened the last of his reserve. Clara then offered what scraps of memory she could: a market lane in Helena, a harness maker's sign, a house with an iron knocker. The preacher promised to send telegraph inquiries and post notices where travelers might pass. Women in the crowd pressed tangible kindness into Elijah's hands: a wrapped loaf, a knitted cap, a folded shawl. Immediate aid arrived, plain and useful, mending need while the slower machinery of law prepared to answer. Elijah felt the quiet support of his ranch hands in his mind as if their faces stood beside him. Their steady presence promised labor and practical backing rather than empty sentiment. He drew a plan in his head, post a notice at the telegraph office, consult the county clerk, seek counsel from a lawyer familiar with guardianship, and if the court permitted, keep the girls at the ranch while searches continued. He would cover burial costs, set aside funds for food and clothing, and record every expense for transparency. Before leaving the graveside, he knelt and placed a worn coin near the head of the plot as a token of care. He offered a short prayer he had not spoken aloud since Sarah's funeral, asking for steadiness and guidance. Rising, he spoke to Clara and Emma with a voice firmer than he felt, and promised to pursue legal steps and to not abandon them to the road. Clara's eyes reflected a careful trust at that pledge, and Emma tucked her small face into her sister's side as if confirming new safety. The ride back crossed fields rimed with frost and shadowed by long fence lines. Clara adjusted the shawl a townswoman had given her and watched the land pass with an attentive gaze cataloging safety. Emma hummed a tiny tune, the sound ordinary and steady, and the hum settled Elijah's pulse more than he expected. He thought of the practical journeys ahead, travel if searches demanded, letters to officials, receipts to file, but also of nearer duties, hot meals, clean bedding, hands to soothe a fevered brow. Back at the ranch, he posted the required notice at the telegraph office and set the cook to prepare nourishing broth and stronger bedding. He wrote crisp notes to the county clerk and consulted a lawyer experienced in guardianship. He left word with the deputy explaining his intent and established a modest account to cover immediate needs. In the kitchen, he set the wrapped loaf on the table and watched Clara and Emma eat slowly, finding a small comfort in ordinary food. The house took on a provisional rhythm. Kettles boiled, blankets were smoothed, lanterns remained trimmed for night. That night, Elijah stood on the porch watching 2,000 acres beneath a clear sweep of stars. He felt a steady heat of responsibility rise within, warming the cold left by grief and shaping a purpose that moved him forward. The telegram's cruel timing had altered everything, yet in that alteration he found direction. He closed his fingers once and relaxed them, then turned inward and spoke out toward listening ears, as if inviting others into the quiet field of care. Has kindness ever changed your path? Tell us below. Before sleep, he checked the children's bedding, smoothed a blanket over Emma, and lingered by Clara's shoulder. He promised them shelter and a search for kin at dawn, stepped inside, and closed the door against a wind that carried new resolve. Dawn would bring necessary answers. Elijah closed the door with a slow hand and guided Clara and Emma into the house where sunlight warmed wooden boards and made dust motes move like small, slow memories. The stove kept a faint heat, and the scent of boiled grain threaded the rooms, a familiar comfort that once had been Sarah's alone. Clara paused at the threshold and ran a cautious eye over the parlor, noting a cracked bowl, a folded shawl, a chair whose rocker still bore an imprint. Emma clung to the bear and breathed unevenly. He showed modest corners prepared for rest. Blankets folded on a small mattress, a wicker trunk for clothes, a shelf with chipped plates. Gestures were practical and spare, offering shelter without promise of permanence. Elijah spoke little, his words plain and measured. He explained chores in short phrases: feed hens, carry water, sweep porch, so duties could anchor days and make time predictable. Clara listened with careful focus, nodding when tasks matched her capacity, while Emma watched with sudden, unguarded interest at a chipped cup. Food arrived as the first covenant between house and stranger. The cook set a shallow bowl of warm porridge and a piece of buttered bread before the children. Emma ate with greedy motions and Clara chewed slowly, letting each mouthful prove that tomorrow might arrive more steadily. The men performed tasks instead of questions, mending harnesses, oiling hinges, trimming lamps. Their silence protected privacy and allowed trust to form without pressure. Clara moved through the house with careful curiosity, touching curtain hems, fingering buttons, smoothing cloth Sarah had once folded. Her hands worked with competence born of necessity. She learned quickly how to wash a pan, fold towels to dry faster, knead dough until gluten gave. The cook taught with patience balanced by firmness. Their fingers moved in tandem, as if passing down a craft. Emma watched, clapped at small victories, and finally smiled in a way that eased the room. Routines eased sharp edges. Morning chores threaded the day: milking, feeding, mending. Elijah taught Clara to check a colt's leg and spot a cough that urged rest. She watched at work, leaning into instruction without haste. and in doing so quiet confidence grew beneath her measured exterior. Emma loved mornings most of all. Sunlight on river water, crumbs for ducks, the smell of hay warmed by sun, practical neighbors stitched a net around the household. A farmer delivered flour, a seamstress brought cloth, the county clerk confirmed telegraph notices. Each visit tested a fragile assumption that community threads might hold. Clara accepted offers of tutoring and small sewing work with few words, while Elijah recorded expenses in Sarah's ledger to ensure transparency. Conversations were sparse but significant. At dusk, Elijah sat by the stove and described the land where frost gathered first, how a storm's edge felt where a spring ran. He pointed out a boundary marker and told a story about a trespass righted long ago. Clara offered memories in fragments, a hymn hummed while mending, a market where Mary had bartered, a place that might hold a friend. Those small disclosures built a bridge between lives. Evenings included work shared beneath lamplight, mending, peeling potatoes, teaching Emma counting game. The men hummed while stitching, and domestic noise braided into a rhythm that no longer felt intrusive. At times Elijah watched the sisters with astonished relief, as if the house had shifted from museum of absence into a place alive with small voices. Trust formed in tiny acts. One morning Elijah found Clara sweeping, then placing a sprig of dried lavender where Sarah once kept it. Another day, Emma fetched his cap in rain and pressed it into his hand. Those tiny offerings loosened the tightness of his days. Legal questions remained a persistent shadow. The sheriff's office required documentation, and the possibility of a claimant hovered like a cloud. Elijah kept records, wrote letters, and spoke with a lawyer about temporary guardianship. While paperwork moved in town, domestic life consolidated at home. Ledger entries balanced against stove warmth. Clara's cautious hope unfolded into small decisions. She arranged a corner as her own, a clean sheet, a line of flattened stones holding the bear, and a book with a frayed cover. Emma adopted a stool by the window where sunlight pooled each morning. Together they learned rhythm, chores, study, play, and tea before bed. These rituals taught permanence in increments rather than proclamations. Days lengthened and seasons edged forward. Frosted mornings gave way to crisp afternoons, and the land prepared for winter. Elijah taught the girls how to stack wood and layer bedding. Clara learned to store seed, and Emma found where sparrows took offering. The work connected them physically and emotionally, making dependence reciprocal. The ranch needed hands as much as the children needed refuge. Occasional unease showed stakes. A suited man paused by the gate asking about kin with possible claim. Elijah invited him to tea and answered firmly. The man left promising to report findings, and the household waited. Such moments braided tension into otherwise ordinary days. At night, under pricked stars, Elijah sat with a lantern and watched the girls sleep. He hummed a hymn fragment Sarah had liked, and cadence settled the house. Responsibility in his chest warmed into a steady glow. He felt sorrow for what had been lost, but also contentment that care, small, repetitive, human, could weave new life from ragged edges. He did not pretend resolution. Paperwork might produce claims, health could falter, law could demand adjustments. Yet within daily feeding, teaching, and mending, a domestic promise had taken root. The house, warmed by work and laughter, did not erase absence, but held it beside new beginning. One afternoon, Clara planted a cutting by the porch and pressed soil with determined fingers. She stepped back and smiled at slender green against brown earth, as if making a private covenant. Elijah, watching, felt quiet pride sharpen into purpose. He would tend that plant as he tended the girls, with patient persistence, regular attention, and a stubborn willingness to hope. The future remained uncertain and threaded with legal hurdles, but the present offered a measured, tangible refuge in the beginning of a life knitted slowly from ordinary acts. In the weeks that followed, small markers of ordinary life gathered like careful stitches. Clara learned to read ledger entries and marked payments for coal and flour with steady hands. She wrote a short letter to a teacher in town requesting evening lessons, so she could continue schooling despite the season's work. Emma practiced tying knots that later bound feed sacks and hummed while chasing hens, a sound that braided through the yard and softened even the men's brows. The cook taught pastry folding and shared a secret for pastry that made the children grin. Neighbors brought small favors: a jar of preserves, spare thread, a wool cap for winter nights. Each kindness made the household feel less temporary and more like a place where memory might be kept alongside new days. Elijah balanced ledgers by lamp and told stories of small wrongs righted, and in hearing him, Clara learned the cadence of belonging and the steadiness of choosing to stay. At night they planned for spring seed and quietly hoped together. Now, Months moved along with the measured certainty of seasons, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that stitched days into a steady cloth. Morning found Clara at dawn, hands raw from learning to milk without startling a cold breath visible in the sharp air as she bent over a patient mare. Snow dusted fence lines like powdered sugar. Emma ran small errands with proud, clumsy steps, balancing a wooden bowl and humming a tune she had invented to mark chores. Elijah watched the transformation with a surprise that warmed him more than stove embers. Laughter returned, first short and uncertain, then louder and more frequent, echoing off weathered beams. He found himself answering with a sound that felt foreign and right, the kind of honest mirth Sarah had coaxed out from him in better times. The men traded easy jokes around work, their voices threaded through daily labor and made solitude less total. At noon, the cook lifted a lid and steam rose like a small mirror of care. Clara learned to read animal temper and soil the way a map reader learns routes. She could tell which sow needed rest and when a colt favored one leg, and she gauged weather by the slope of clouds as accurately as any old hand. She practiced stitches in the cook's spare minutes, wrapping seams with fingers that grew deft and patient. At the hearth, she learned bread-making, folding dough, listening for the right hush of yeast, and judging crust by the way the room smelled. Emma, once frail, gained color and appetite. She chased hens with a vigor that shamed recent weakness. Days arranged themselves into pockets of industry and small celebrations. Mending fences became a lesson in trust. Two hands steadying a post while another tightened wire until tension held. The physical labor taught more than craft, it taught reliance. Clara learned to trust Elijah's directions, and in replying with a nod she showed that faith. At twilight they shared tasks by lantern light. Someone stitched, another read aloud, and a child examined knots taught earlier. In those ordinary acts the family discovered a new grammar for belonging. Winter arrived with more authority than anyone expected. Snow came heavy and white, pressing quiet over pastures and turning the house into a luminous box against dark fields. The cook baked dense pies and set big kettles to simmer while men checked roofs and layered straw for animal bedding. Clara carried wood stacked high and returned with cheeks painted by wind, eyes bright with a steady purpose. Emma learned to set small fires in the hearth and loved watching sparks lift, then die, fascinated by tiny flares that bent into smoke. Work brought closeness. The cook taught Clara to fold pastry with a wrist motion that turned dough into a tender thing, and the sisters later shared the spoils. Warm crusts flaked under their teeth, and laughter rose between bites. Elijah showed Clara how to mend a harness rein with precise stitches, so a horse could carry safely, and her hands moved with gained authority like a woman becoming a steward. Trust bred courage, risk diminished because support sat close by. Neighbors eased into the new arrangement with a kind of approving curiosity. A woman from the next farm left a jar of preserved cherries with a note and a spare shawl. A boy from town brought a bundle of reading primers for Clara and a small wooden whistle for Emma. Invitations to communal chores came and were accepted with polite eagerness. Sewing bees and meat canning sessions found the sisters learning neighbors' names and trades. Each visit added a thread of belonging and stitched their lives into broader cloth. The girls grew in competence and in quiet personality. Clara's face kept a thoughtful line and her humor arrived in sharp, well-timed smiles that startled listeners into real laughter. Emma became a small sun at play, a grin ready to bloom at simple jokes. She danced with a broom and invented games that made chickens scatter and men clap in delight. Elijah watched these changes as if counting blessings, grateful for sound that had not sat in the house since Sarah's last morning. Evenings offered instruction and story. By lamplight, Elijah relayed frontier lore, how to read spore, why certain herbs eased a fever, and which fences a storm would likely test. The sisters listened as if collecting tools for future storms. They asked questions that revealed practical intelligence and a hunger to understand land and law. Those conversations built their competence and knit a shared vocabulary of survival and care. Small tests probed the bond. A harsh wind tore through a barn roof one night and forced men to work until dawn to rebuild what weather tried to steal. Clara crawled into rafters to secure loose boards. Emma held lanterns steady while hands passed up nails. Their effort mattered materially and symbolically. The household's resilience depended on such contributions, and when dawn broke, the group greeted warmth with tired, sincere smiles. A more private trial arrived when Clara fell ill, a fever borrowing strength from winter's thin light. Worries tightened shoulders. Elijah watched with raw fear familiar to any father. The cook brewed tonic and laid cloths to cool the fevered brow. Emma refused to leave her sister's side. Elijah measured each breath and kept vigil through a long night. Memories of Mary and Sarah braided into his worry. When morning eased the worst, relief spread like thaw. The recovery proved the truth that care given with steady hands and patient hours could alter a precarious fate. In quiet moments, laughter turned reflective. Around the stove, they traded memories, stories of small, stubborn neighbors, a prank years before, how lost sheep sometimes turned up under impossible circumstances. Those shared recollections anchored. Occasionally, Elijah caught himself humming a song Sarah favored, and Clara would join in with voice soft and steady. Their duet filled a space with layered memory, sorrow threaded with new comfort. The ranch changed outwardly too. The yard gained new fence posts. The barn's side was repaired with clean boards, and the garden held more beds than the previous season. The animals looked healthier, their coats gleaming under sunlight that seemed kinder for the care invested. The name carved by a visiting hand, Milk Haven, found occasional use in town once neighbors spread the tale of a shelter where children found care after desperate travel. One evening, gathered about the hearth, Elijah asked aloud in a voice that carried more invitation than command, "Who's your chosen family? Share their story." The questions circled the room like steam, and each answer, short, honest, full of memory, made the circle tighter. In those responses, the household found affirmation. Chosen bonds held weight. In time, the light in Elijah's eyes shifted. Grief still lurked like winter shadows, but laughter and work had cleared enough ground for joy to return in manageable measure. The family they had become did not erase loss, yet it layered present days with meaning and purpose. Together they faced weather and market, feast and famine, and the simple miracle of daily care became their most honest measure of success. Each morning they rose with gratitude, hands ready to labor and hearts learning the slow art of keeping one another safe and seen, always. The courthouse smelled of oil and ink in the hush of townsfolk who came to witness a small, solemn joy. Wooden benches creaked under coats and steady faces. Neighbors arrived with work-worn hands and eyes that hoped for right action. Elijah stood with Sarah's ledger folded in his jacket and Mary's oilcloth packet beside him. Clara gripped Emma's fingers, keeping her small sister close, while Emma watched the room with unquestioning trust. The judge read the petition in even tones and asked if anyone wished to speak. A few neighbors rose to offer testimony, describing the wagon's arrival, Mary's worn papers, and the children's need. The lawyer explained the process plainly, and the sheriff confirmed there had been no claim from Helena. When the clerk called the vote and the judge pronounced the petition granted, a soft sound rose and swelled into applause. Clara drew a long breath and Emma's grip tightened in a grip that felt like a promise. Elijah stepped forward to thank those who had spoken. His voice was steady, though his throat felt thick. The clerk stamped the record and the paper's seal made the pledge tangible, an official line connecting names to care. They returned beneath a harvest moon that poured silver across the plains and softened fence lines. Lanterns hung from porch beams and bulbs brightened the eaves, making the house look as if it wore a crown. In the barn, the men set long tables on rough boards and spread cloths stitched by the cook. Iron pits held crackling fires that sent tiny sparks toward stars. Neighbors arrived with pies, jars of preserves, glazed ham, and loaves wrapped in cloth. Children ran between legs, cheeks flushed by cold air, their laughter pulling tight the room's loose edges and easing the memory of sorrow. The smell of roasted meat and buttered bread braided with smoke and sweet cider. Elijah sat at the head of the table, not as a solitary man, but as someone chosen by fate and neighbors to lead a household formed by mercy. Conversation threaded through the night. Who would mend which fence in spring? Who might lend seed? Which neighbor could teach Clara to read when work slowed? Later songs rose, old work tunes and a hymn Sarah had favored, and Elijah found his voice joining the chorus without planning to. The cook brought a simple cake in the barn filled with the warm, honest noise of people feeding one another in more ways than hunger. Legal steps were followed with practical care. Papers were filed and recorded in county books. A lawyer recorded guardianship details and the sheriff noted custody line. Clara enrolled in a small-town class and studied by lamplight, practicing letters and simple sums until ink stained her fingers. Emma grew bolder by slow degrees. She fetched eggs, learned to bring water without spilling, and offered feathers to the cook, who rewarded her with crust and a smile. Elijah taught Clara how to read ledger marks and manage purchases, showing her how Sarah had kept accounts with tidy strokes. Neighbors continued to help with supplies and counsel. They planned seed and fruit trees, arranged who would watch animals during market trips, and agreed who would teach which craft. Milk Haven Ranch's name began to ripple through town talk as a place of refuge and honest care. A traveling merchant left a stack of blankets. A seamstress mended garments and taught Clara a neat hem that helped her earn small wages. Community acts shifted their life from fragile survival toward steady living. The seasons braided into a year. Emma began to call Elijah Papa more often, and each time the word settled into him like a small treasure. He answered naturally, affections shifting in a quiet realignment that made old sorrow a softer present. Laughter returned and became belonging, and his hands once hollowed by grief filled with purposeful labor. Mending fence, teaching a child to hitch a wagon, patching a coat with precise stitches. The men who worked the ranch carried tasks with easier hearts because joy threaded morning chores. Trials came and taught them strength. A winter storm tore at a roof and forced men into long hours securing boards. Clara crawled into rafters to fasten loose planks while Emma held a lantern steady. Once a fever tightened Clara's breath and everyone felt fear sharpen. Long vigils, simple tonics, and patient hands eased the worst. Those trials proved resilience and showed how steady care could alter a precarious fate. One evening by the stove, Elijah opened Sarah's old journal and added notes. Expenses paid, names of those who had offered aid, seeds ordered. He inked a promise rather than an account, shelter kept, children taught, community honored. The entry sealed his decision to tend what started with a whisper. Stories of their arrival spread. Travelers passing through town told how a child's pleading changed a man, and how neighbors stitched them into the whole. People asked if a twist remained. Elijah would smile and say that land keeps surprises, and that kindness often returns in unexpected forms. He found himself asking listeners in simple terms, what act of kindness shaped your life? Share to inspire others. If this story moved you, like, share, and follow for more tales that touch the heart. The whisper that began it, "Can we have milk?" echoed across fences and invited strangers to answer with small, meaningful gestures. In court, the judge pronounced the petition granted, and a hush rose into soft applause. Clara exhaled and Emma tightened her small grip as relief spread across faces. Elijah stepped forward and thanked neighbors who had testified. His voice held steady though emotion warmed it. The clerk stamped the record and the paper's seal made the pledge tangible, binding names to care in the county book. On the ride home, the harvest moon hung high and lamps in windows winked approval. News of the decision moved quickly through the yard and the barn leapt into life with preparations. Lanterns were trimmed, boards became tables, and fires were banked to throw heat into the night. Someone painted a banner that read Milk Haven Ranch and hung it from a beam. The letters fluttered like a promise. Neighbors arrived carrying pies, jars, a basket of baked apples, and loaves wrapped in cloth. A traveling fiddler tuned strings near the door while children darted between legs with plates. Emma ran first to Elijah, threw her arms around his leg, and said plainly, "Pop." The name settled inside him like a small treasure. He laughed, kissed her head, and felt a warmth he had not expected since Sarah's passing. They ate, sang old tunes, and made toasts to new beginnings and to those who offered shelter. Weeks later, Elijah kept Sarah's ledger updated with careful notes of gifts and expenses. The tale of arrival and care spread through town, and travelers repeated it as a lesson. Small mercy often becomes a chain. The twist will shock you. Elijah stood where the porch met the dusk, watching an autumn sun fold itself behind distant hills. The air smelled of warm hay and cooling earth. A gentle wind moved reeds along the creek and carried the faint laughter of women in town. Beside him, Clara and Emma leaned on the railing, shadows long and comfortable across their shoulders. Time had layered them with quiet competence. Clara handled accounts, ordered seed, and oversaw deliveries with neat handwriting that Sarah would have approved. They recalled the first night, not to linger in sorrow but to mark how much had shifted. Clara's small, fierce face asked for milk as the wagon rolled toward the porch, and the request loosened care no single person could nod alone. Mary's oilcloth packet and faded photograph remained pressed in a book on the mantel. The paper smelled faintly of rain and road. A tin cup hung by the kitchen pegboard, dented and scratched, humble and holy. Visitors pressed palms to metal and left small notes of thanks. Daily life at the ranch settled into rhythms of work and tenderness. Dawn required milking, mending, and measurement. Afternoon demanded tending and repair. Evening held tasks that made hearth and table a sanctuary. Clara measured feed with exactness and learned to mend leather reins, her hands quick with acquired skill. Emma studied by lamplight, reading aloud in soft syllables that stitched new maps into her mind. Together they built competence and steadiness. Neighbors wove practical kindness into their days. A seamstress taught hems, and in return Clara mended a harness. A fiddler offered lessons and sometimes played beneath the eaves, while people danced on hay-strewn floors. The county clerk kept records with indulgent patience and fondness for the wagon's tail. Small gifts accrued, preserves, needles, primers for study. Each gift made the household less precarious. Love here was pragmatic and fierce. It showed in shared chores and the way hands steadied one another through weather and illness. Winter required extra work. They stacked wood and banked stoves to keep animals warm. Once a fever took Clara and the house held vigil. The cook brewed tonics and the men checked temperatures by lamplight. The illness passed because devotion kept watch. each person practicing care and small acts that amounted to rescue. Elijah changed in ways he had not anticipated. Grief remained a place he visited, a quiet room with Sarah's shawl folded within. Yet laughter returned like a careful guest that sat for tea and stayed. He learned to find pulses of joy in simple things. Emma's small song while fetching eggs, Clara's neat columns of ink, a neighbor bringing extra potatoes, where silence had been his companion. Conversation threaded afternoon. He taught chores and law, but the girls taught him to notice spring bulbs in particular shades of sky that promised rain. They commemorated Mary in small rituals. A wooden cross leaned near the barn, and on certain days Clara swept a spot until the dust lay like a soft prayer. They kept Mary's papers folded in a box and read them aloud on anniversaries, adding a line of thanks. Those acts kept Mary's presence without turning her into a monument. Success arrived in measured ways. The harvest planted enough grain for winter stores and a bit beyond. Emma received notice of a scholarship for evening study in town and returned with shy pride. Clara taught reading to village children, earning modest coin and a proud tilt of her head when a learner sounded a new word. The ranch's name reached farther than fences. Travelers heard the tale and sometimes left small tokens. Out of gratitude, they kept a tin cup on the pegboard where it had hung since that first night. Guests asked about it, and Elijah told a short version. A woman's death, 2 girls, a whispered plea. He rarely added how a simple vessel could carry the weight of a life, and saying less, he let listeners add their own imagining. Most left with softened gait and coins pressed into practical hands. At dusk, a harvest moon fell full and golden into the yard, turning fence posts into soft pillars. The 3 sat at the end of the porch, cups steaming with strong broth, and watched geese move south in formation, silhouettes carved against the sky. Elijah traced a line of scar on his palm and remembered a winter when Sarah sewed a button by lantern light. Clara hummed a hymn fragment, and Emma counted migrating shapes until cold tinged their noses. Then, as light drained, Elijah turned and spoke in a voice kind and weathered. What act of kindness shaped your life? Share to inspire others. He did not ask for praise or money, but for stories, believing shared narratives could encourage small mercies elsewhere. The girls listened. Emma tapped her cup thoughtfully and promised to write to a teacher in town. He walked the fence line once more with them, steps measured and conversations sparse, until Emma started a tune that Clara joined in. Harmony soft as wool. Stars pricked overhead and the world felt folded into a single, manageable story. Elijah thought of the ripple that began with milk and had spread into sure things. Education, harvest, legal papers, a sign above a gate. Gratitude for stewarding this life sat steady and humble. Clara's stewardship deepened over seasons. She read sky and soil with practiced regard, ordered seed at proper times, balanced ledgers, and negotiated fair trade at market. People sought her counsel about grafting apple scions and rotating fields. She answered with clear instruction and patient demonstration. Young helpers learned stitches for harness reins and the right pressure for a mare's flank. Emma's schooling widened into plans. She studied bookkeeping and civic matters, visited a town library, and returned with fresh phrases and shy ambition. She sketched ideas for a community reading circle and taught a child to sound a hard consonant. Clara sold preserves and plated baskets at market, her neat mark earning polite praise and steady coin. Elijah watched such growth with a steadiness that surprised him. He mended tools, taught boys to tack horses, and sat with Sarah's journal to add small notes about seeds and kindnesses received. The tin cup stayed on its peg, dented, polished, a modest relic of beginning. Travelers touched it respectfully, left notes telling how a similar mercy had altered a course. Those notes formed a collection showing roads from need to care. The ranch matured into a place that practiced mercy as craft. Simple acts repeated, warm meals, steady hands, legal notices filed became an architecture of survival. Children learned that kindness could be vocational. Neighbors taught trades, knowing reciprocity would return. In that way, the little request for milk echoed outward and built a durable life under open sky always. Finally, before night closed, he addressed the listener beyond the farm's edge, as if the voice might travel with neighbors and strangers alike. What act of kindness shaped your life? Share to inspire others. He paused, letting the question settle, then leaned forward with a plain request that had become their customary ending. Like, share, and follow for more stories that touch the heart. The twist will shock you. The last line was both invitation and a wink at mystery as night gathered close.